They never screamed. Not because they weren't in agony, but because the nurses had already removed their tongues. There are places carved out of history with surgical precision, entire timelines, cauterized like infected flesh, removed so cleanly that even their shadows have been forgotten. Bellview Asylum is one of them. Officially it was closed due to sanitation violations in 1902. Unofficially it was an experimental theater in psychological warfare, a silent cathedral of control, and the ones pulling the strings wore white aprons, not black robes. Maine, a winter so brutal it split trees from the inside, and tucked between frostbitten cliffs and endless pine was Bellview, a facility that called itself a refuge for the disturbed. What it really was a vault for the inconvenient. Not criminals, not the insane, but those who knew too much. Whistleblowers, widows of powerful men, children who survived rituals they weren't supposed to remember. They didn't arrive by ambulance. They were escorted in horse-drawn carts under military flag, paper trails forged, memories wiped. The nurses weren't nurses at all. Most had no prior medical training. What they did have were sealed files and government pay stubs. Operatives, under the guise of caregivers, enforcers of silence, practitioners of a science that didn't yet have a name: psychological erasure. Once inside, the patients weren't treated. They were studied, disassembled, not physically, not at first. Their beliefs, values, memories peeled back like layers of old wallpaper. It wasn't about curing madness. It was about inducing it, surgically replacing a person's inner framework with silence, obedience, vacancy. There were no screams echoing through Bellevue's long granite halls, just the hum of something cold, something calculated. Hallways were built in spirals. Mirrors were embedded behind false bricks, and above the 5th floor, restricted only to level 3 nurses, was the eye room. No doors, no official plans, just a rumor passed between kitchen staff and night guards. If the eye watches you, you won't be here in the morning. And then the disappearances began. Not patients, nurses one by one. The women who had orchestrated the cruelty began vanishing from locked rooms, their white shoes left behind. Always bloody, but no bodies, no records, no return. And that was when the whispers started, not from the living, but from the ones whose tongues had been taken. The silence inside Bellevue was never natural, it was engineered. The floors didn't creak, the clocks didn't tick, no birds landed on the windowsills. Even the wind somehow didn't howl. That quiet wasn't peace, it was submission. Something ancient had claimed the air and demanded reverence, and the nurses obeyed it more than they obeyed any medical board or ethical code. There were 39 nurses assigned to Bellevue between 1899 and 1902. 27 of them were transferred in under falsified identities. Many had no family, no census entries, no confirmed birth records, but they each shared one thing: an initiation. A mark hidden behind the ear, under the skin. The sigil wasn't ink. It glowed under phosphor, pulsed under heat. It resembled a serpent biting its own spine, not the tail, the spine. A symbol of control through recursion, pain feeding pain, a loop of silence. Patients would sometimes go catatonic after looking too long into a nurse's eyes, not just from fear, but from memory collapse. Witnesses feeling disoriented around them. Time seemed to stretch or blink. One man claimed he lost 3 hours just walking from the dining hall to the basement. He quit the next day, shot himself a week later. No note, just a single sentence carved into his kitchen table: they speak through stillness. By spring of 1901, Bellevue had 119 patients. By summer, only 76 remained. No one was discharged, no deaths were recorded, just removals. The files were clinical, bloodless. Subject number 045, removed from process at 3:14 a.m. No aftercare required. Subject number 072, dissolved through sequence B. Subject number 081, eyes consumed. That last one wasn't metaphorical. And somewhere between June and July, the facility was locked down, not by state order, from within. A steel mechanism, built into the walls decades prior, sealed the only external entrance with an impact-activated hydraulic vault. No key, no code, just a pulse plate that responded to a single thing: fear, a biological lock, a living password. The nurses called at the threshold. If your heart rate passed a certain threshold near the door, it opened, but only if you were trying to run. They were testing responses, measuring panic, observing escape behavior as a form of data. And the patients weren't subjects of healing, but nodes in a grander algorithm of submission. Not to medicine, not to science, but to something deeper, something that wanted obedience not through force, but through disintegration of self. There were no journals kept inside Bellevue, only logs, not personal, not reflective, just observations, timestamps, patterns. The institution didn't treat the mind as something sacred or human. They treated it like a mechanism to dismantle, a lock to pick. And the nurses, they weren't writing about symptoms. They were tracking responses to induced trauma. 1. Recovered log entry: read. Subject 12 placed in isolation tank 4. After 9 hours. Speech reduced to phonemes. After 16, no recognition of personal name. After 23, dissociative compliance achieved. Recommend Phase 2, submission without sedation. This wasn't madness. It was ritual programming. Bellevue's basement was off limits to all staff below clearance red. Rumors said it extended beneath the earth for 6 floors, some of which predated the asylum by centuries. Blueprints show only 2 levels, but excavation records, if they ever existed, were erased from state archives. What did exist was a single, cryptic ledger found during demolition, weathered, leather-bound, burned at the edges. It contained hand-drawn diagrams of human brains split into quadrants, not anatomical, but symbolic. One quadrant labeled obedience, another, memory, the third, ritual pathway, and the fourth, just an Ouroboros symbol. The serpent again. The deeper the institution drilled into the mind, the more the language of their records shifted from medical to alchemical. They were transmuting souls. One patient, Eliza Crane, was a schoolteacher committed after she accused the town's mayor of trafficking children to Bellview. Her file stated acute paranoid delusions. But buried in the margins of her intake form, a nurse had scribbled something in Latin. Veritas videt, said loqui non potest. Truth sees, but cannot speak. Eliza didn't make it 3 weeks. Her body wasn't found, only her dress, laid out neatly on the tiled floor of her room, covered in coal dust. The window was locked from the inside. Her mattress was untouched. The only clue left behind was a single word carved into the concrete beneath her bed in fingernail scratches. Below, witnesses said the nurses began chanting after she vanished. Not prayers, not grief, something else. A tonal rhythm that made the walls vibrate. An orderly bled from his ears and collapsed after hearing it. When he regained consciousness, he couldn't remember his own name. Just one sentence he kept repeating over and over. They opened the door through the empty ones. That was Bellevue's darkest secret. The patients were never the final target. They were keys. The architecture of Bellevue wasn't built to heal, it was built to contain not patients, not illness, but something far older. The foundation stones weren't local. Black shale laced with quartzite veins that shimmered under heat, imported from an unknown quarry in Europe. The stones hummed under pressure literally. When touched, they vibrated faintly, like a tuning fork struck somewhere too deep to hear. Masons who laid them in 1891 refused to stay past sunset. 1. Benjamin Rock left a letter for his wife the night before he hanged himself in the construction shed. It ended with the words, "They are not building walls. They are building mouths." It wasn't a metaphor. There were voices inside the stone, but only the broken could hear them. That was the point. Break the patient, break the mind, crack the consciousness like brittle porcelain, and the voices seeped in slowly, with surgical precision, like water searching for the hairline fracture. Not to possess, but to rewrite. The programming came in frequencies delivered through the piping, the lighting, even the water. Sound beyond human range. Words not meant to be heard consciously but absorbed, like poison through the skin. A whisper engineered by absence. And those who resisted, the non-responsive patients, they didn't die, they vanished. Completely. Nurse Catherine Wren kept a private indexed on pages, hidden inside hollowed-out floorboards beneath Ward C. Her notes weren't scientific. They were desperate. In her final entry she scrawled, "They don't kill the ones who break. They need the broken. They kill the ones who remember." She was found strangled in the hydrotherapy chamber. No water in her lungs. No bruises on her neck. Just a look on her face, eyelids torn open from the inside, pupils blown, and her tongue split down the center, as if something had tried to silence her forever from within. A former patient, Malcolm Dreyer, escaped in 1902 during the lockdown breach. He'd been institutionalized for writing a series of letters to the Boston Herald, claiming that Bellevue was a soul farm operated by an order older than Christianity. After escaping, he fled to Canada and lived off-grid before his death. He left behind a series of wax cylinder recordings. On one, his last words were, "They are not healing the mad. They are harvesting what slips through the cracks when sanity is removed. They're building vessels, human shells. And the ones they take, they don't come back empty." This wasn't treatment, it was transformation. By autumn of 1901, the asylum had become a gate, not metaphorically but functionally, a crossing point, not between life and death, but between what is seen and what watches. And the nurses were its sentinels, keepers of a threshold the world was never supposed to know existed. Their rituals became more frequent, more complex. At first they were performed in the sub-basement, but by late October, they took place in the open within the chapel, under the false guise of therapeutic mass. Patients were seated in rows, drugged or docile. The cross had been removed from the altar. In its place stood a stone monolith, obsidian carved with glyphs that pulsed under candlelight. No one knew where the stone came from. It wasn't there the month before. It wasn't installed. It was summoned. The sermons that followed weren't Christian. They weren't even in a recognizable tongue. Yet every nurse knew them fluently. They chanted in unison. And as they did, the patients began to bleed from the eyes. Not scream, not convulse. Just sit, silent tears of crimson sliding down their cheeks, as if something inside them was being pulled out. The rituals weren't symbolic. They were operative. A cleansing, a rewriting, a harvesting. And the I room, the one with no doors, no floor plan. Activator guards reported flickering lights above the 5th floor. Screams that weren't screams, just reversed voices echoing through vents. One night, a janitor walked past the hallway and saw light pouring from the rooms. It seems as if it were on fire inside. But no heat, no sound, just light, and the impression of something watching back. He never returned for his next shift. No one asked questions. By this point, Bellview had shed all pretense of being an asylum. It became what it was always designed, to be a machine, not mechanical, ritualistic, a living construct that thrived on the inversion of truth, where sanity was the illness, and silence was the cure. And still outside the asylum, nothing. No press, no state intervention, no outrage, only silence, because the asylum wasn't hidden. It was protected by those in power, those who needed it. Because Bellview wasn't a rogue operation, it was a prototype, one of 7, a seed planted to see how deeply obedience could be implanted, how icily the soul could be emptied and overwritten. And now, you know why it was erased. It wasn't madness they were perfecting, it was obedience without consent. To erase the will of a man and replace it with silence takes more than violence. It requires ritualized engineering, a precise unraveling of memory, identity, resistance. Bellview was the template, but its purpose reached far beyond its walls. The patients weren't random. They were selected, pulled from various walks of life: politicians' sons, war veterans, factory workers who'd seen things they shouldn't have, even children who'd survived bizarre events in rural churches, mines, orphanages. Each one had witnessed something. Each one knew something that couldn't be allowed to exist in the public domain. They weren't mad when they arrived, but they were broken when they left, if they ever left. Because the nurses didn't just observe, they constructed. Identity was taken apart and rebuilt using 3 methods: trauma, repetition, sleep erasure, and mirror exposure. They called it the trifold key, a psychological trifecta engineered to dissolve resistance and allow something else to take root inside the human frame. There was a 4th phase, but its name was redacted in every surviving file. Only the result remained. Phase 4 successful. Full subjugation achieved. Host no longer retains original directive. Host, not patient, not human host, one survivor, if he can be called that, was found in 1933, decades after Bellevue's closure, wandering the outskirts of Portland. Malnourished, covered in ash, no identification. But when questioned, he muttered a single phrase over and over: "I dreamed," in someone else's voice. His blood had traces of an unknown compound. Not a drug, not a hallucinogen, something biological. Synthetic strands of neural inhibitors that wouldn't be discovered by modern science for another 70 years. He had no fingerprints, not because they were burned off, because they were never formed. What returned from Bellevue wasn't always what went in. And what entered those rituals, those patients forced to chant in tongues they didn't know. Exposed to machines powered not by electricity but by will, they came back quiet, perfectly still. No emotion, no memory, just obedience. They would blend in, get jobs, wear suits, smile at neighbors, but at night, some would stand motionless in their homes for hours, as if listening, waiting for reactivation. This wasn't about healing, this was about infiltration. And it started inside a quiet asylum no one talks about. Because what came out of Bellevue never wanted to be found. In November of 1901, snow fell over Bellview Asylum in sheets so dense it erased the landscape, like the world was trying to cover something up. But beneath that white silence, the rituals escalated. The nurses no longer operated in shifts. They lived in rotations, 3-day cycles of chanting, fasting, and exposure treatment. Exposure to what? No one dared write down. Surveillance logs only recorded symptoms: blackened veins, reversed sleep cycles, synchronized dreams. Some nurses began drawing symbols in their own blood, perfectly symmetrical, as if their hands were no longer their own. The staff psychologist, Dr. Leland Maris, kept one final personal recording, a wax cylinder discovered decades later in a locked drawer behind his office fireplace. His voice trembled as he whispered into the horn: "They're not treating trauma. They're cultivating it. Pain opens doors, not metaphorically lit." I watched a woman bleed out from her eyes, and when she died, something looked through her. By this point, the asylum had fully disconnected from the outside world. The telegraph lines were damaged in a storm. No mail entered, no staff exited, and yet supplies kept arriving, delivered at night. Unmarked carriages, no drivers, no invoices. Someone still funded Bellevue and someone still needed it. Because this wasn't about a failed asylum in Maine. This was a controlled side testing what happens when the mind is made hollow, made vacant, and filled with a new directive, a non-human directive. Patients stopped eating. Nurses stopped aging. One visitora, priest from Augusta, reported a child in a gown levitating 6 inches above the chapel floor. He was never seen again. The bishop declared him missing under God's will. That same week, a new wing was opened at Bellevue. The I wing. It didn't appear on blueprints. It didn't have a floor, just a staircase that descended endlessly, spiraling into cold, black stone. Those who walked down never returned. The few who peeked through the stairwell described a pulsing light at the bottom, organic like a heartbeat, glowing in rhythm with the asylum's electric lamps. When the nurses passed by, they'd place their hands on the wall and whisper something unintelligible. One janitor managed to record a fragment. Through the void of memory, the vessel is filled. Through the broken will, the gate remains. Open. It wasn't an asylum, it was a temple. And the gods it served didn't want worship, they wanted access. By December 1901, Bellevue was no longer functioning under any human authority. Not the state, not the Board of Corrections, not even the church. It had severed all oversight, yet not a single investigation was launched. Why? Because everyone who tried disappeared. A state inspector named Jonathan Hartley filed a report of auditory hallucinations after visiting the facility. He claimed the floors whispered, the stairwells sighed, and every clock ran backward. Within days he was declared insane, institutionalized at a separate facility, and just like that, the file was sealed. Bellevue remained untouchable inside. The nurses had begun ritual synchronization. Every movement mirrored every sentence spoken in tandem. They no longer blinked at random, they blinked together, as if controlled by a shared rhythm deeper than biology, as if something had woven through them a single intelligence. Split into 39 bodies, their leader was never officially named, but in the records found buried under the chapel floor files too ancient to belong to the modern staff, she was referred to only as the Keeper of the Mouthless, a woman dressed in black linen, face always veiled, who never spoke. Witnesses say she communicated through patients, using them like radios. The moment she stepped into a room, the nearest patient would freeze, eyes roll back, and whisper in a voice not their own. Messages always came in pairs. The flesh must be emptied. The eye must remain fed. The eye again. It was the central force, not a metaphor, not a concept, a presence. A presence. It fed on unspoken memory, on repressed trauma, on the unfiltered scream inside every silenced mind. And the rituals, they weren't worship, they were meals. This was when the disappearances accelerated. 10 patients gone in 1 week. No violence, no bodies, just clothing left in neat spirals. On the floor, shirts folded, shoes pointed toward the walls, always surrounded by a fine black dust. The nurses began humming at night, in a frequency low enough to vibrate more. One guard's teeth cracked in his sleep. The humming always preceded a disappearance. Always. Bellview wasn't healing minds, it was repurposing them, breaking down the human firewall and inviting something in, not from the sky, not from hell, but from beneath, where forgotten things whisper through rock, waiting for the right vessel, and they had found one. The final winter of Bellevue was marked by a silence so thick it suffocated the birds. Local hunters said the forest went still. No howls, no branches cracking, even the wind refused to pass near the asylum grounds. Snow gathered in unnatural formations, spirals, circles, intricate geometric shapes too precise for nature, etched across the property like runes. Inside, the walls began to sweat. Not water, something viscous, dark, iridescent, warm, and wherever it pooled, patients would convulse. Their mouths moved silently, mimicking voices that weren't theirs. The nurses documented none of it. Instead, they gathered the fluid in glass jars and took it downstairs to the eye. By January 1902, the staff had stopped speaking altogether. Every command was delivered telepathically or through the mouths of successful vessels. These weren't patients anymore. They were hollow constructs, animated by foreign intent, held together not by flesh but by obedience. One of the nurses left a final note under the floorboards of her quarters before vanishing. It was found in 1957 by a demolition team. We have called it fully through now. It rests beneath the eye. It feeds from memory, not blood. We are no longer required to speak because it remembers for us. That was the purpose of Bellview. Construct memoryless hosts, human shells wiped clean of identity so this other intelligence could inhabit them freely. Not possession, not demonic, something older, something not bound by flesh or language, something that required psychic vacancy, a human mind emptied so thoroughly that it offered no resistance. And when enough vessels were created, it would unfold. The eye wasn't just watching, it was gastatating. One night, during the Great Blackout of February 1902, a survivor, Nurse Abigail Rose, escaped through the western wall. Bleeding, broken, mad, she wandered into a fishing village 3 miles south, covered in that same black substance. She didn't scream, she didn't beg, she just whispered to the constable. It opened. God forgive us. It opened and we fed it our names. She died 36 hours later, her body collapsing into ash. No bones, no trace, just dust, humming faintly. When touched. The following morning, Bellevue's western wing collapsed in on itself. No explosion, no fire, just an inward implosion, as if the earth had decided to swallow what was left. But the eye remained, and its vessels it had already left. By March 1902, the official narrative was sealed. A minor fire, structural instability, staff relocated, all records lost. In the incident, The land was purchased by a private entity name redacted, then marked as non-developable due to geological instability. But every local knew the truth. Nothing grows on Bellevue soil, not a blade of grass, not a single tree. Animals won't go near it. The air tastes of iron, and at night you can still hear humming if you stand close enough. The government didn't investigate. They intervened. Teams in unmarked coats arrived under the cover of fog-burned files, sealed tunnels, pulled stones from the foundation and carted them away in iron crate trucks. But some things couldn't be moved. In the sub-basement, behind a sealed wall, they found the eye. And they didn't destroy it. They activated it. What was once hidden became useful. Bellevue's experiment in obedience, silence, and soul-stripping wasn't a failure, it was a success, a working prototype. And the intelligence behind the eye was now a partner. They called it the Mouthless God. No face, no name, no demand for worship, just one command: vacate the will. And those who obeyed, those who served without question, thrived. Promotions, protection, power. Entire departments were formed to study the Bellevue method, psychological warfare divisions, black ops projects in mental rewriting. Schools were built on the ruins of other forgotten facilities, each modeled after Bellevue's architecture: spiral corridors, soundproof halls, hidden sigils carved under floorboards. But the real breakthrough wasn't the architecture, it was the pattern of fracture. They'd learned how to break people without touch, strip identity without force, rebuild obedience without consent. And they tested it in prisons, in asylums, in television. The eye didn't need to be worshipped, it only needed to be replicated. Its hum, once confined to Bellevue's halls, now echoes in white noise, in flickering screens, in the empty glow of late-night media. The frequency of forgetting, a silent invitation. The eye taught them. The more you erase from a man his name, his past, his defiance, the more space you create for something else to move in. Not all at once, slowly, quietly. So quietly, in fact, that he doesn't notice. He's already become the vessel. And when enough are transformed, the eye will no longer need watchers. It will simply awaken. They called it cognitive decoupling. The precise moment when a human being's internal compass no longer points to truth, memory, or self, but to external instruction. It starts subtly, a moment of silence where there should be resistance. A blink too long. A breath held just a second, past natural. That's how they knew the reprogramming had taken hold. And Bellevue was just the seed. The blueprint was replicated in black sites across the continent. 7 were confirmed. 13 were rumored. None were ever acknowledged, but the rituals remained the same. Break the subject, strip the identity, install the pattern, empty the vessel. Those who survived, and there were few, spoke of a fourth stage beyond even obedience. They called it the reversal, a psychological phenomenon in which the subject not only loses self-awareness but begins to defend the system that destroyed them. This was the final phase, a mind that protects the eye, a voice that repeats its will, a body that walks, eats, votes, teaches, smiles while carrying something not human inside. The success rate was low in 1902, but over the decades, new methods emerged, refined, digitized, broadcast. The eye didn't need physical proximity anymore. It only needed exposure. Sound waves, color patterns, neurolinguistic anchors, all reverse-engineered from the original frequencies discovered in Bellevue's lower levels. Nurses were replaced by scientists, altars by studios. Chapel chants became background music in commercials. The masses were never supposed to notice because noticing required silence. And silence has been saturated, every moment filled, every space occupied, thought drowned in signal. You were taught to fear pain, but they learned it's not pain that breaks the mind, it's distraction. Once the subject forgets how to be alone with themselves, the soul begins to unravel. That's where the eye waits, not in darkness, in noise. So ask yourself, how long has it been since you sat in a room, in total silence, and truly remembered who you are? Because that is where the pattern begins. And if you can't remember your before, then someone, or something, has already rewritten your after. Bellevue didn't close, it just scaled. And now the world is the ward. They didn't burn the eye, they duplicated it. Hollow technologies were developed in its image, devices built not to inform, but to imprint. Machines that whispered not truth, but permission. Permission to forget. Permission to obey. And they did it in plain sight. The blue light of your screen, the flicker rate of advertisements, the rhythmic pulse of modern music. These weren't accidents, they were calibrated. Derived from Bellevue's original hum, refined by neuroscientists trained in covert labs built miles underground. What was once inscribed in stone is now coded in digital signal. And the mouthless God, it doesn't need temples. It lives in transmission. The eye isn't watching you, it's within you. The moment you accepted the lie that silence is dangerous, that boredom is pain, that discomfort must be cured, you gave it ground. The enemy doesn't attack the strong. It waits until the strong forget why they were fighting. That's when the fracture opens. That's when the eye feeds. What they learned at Bellevue was never about one asylum. It was about a scalable system. Predictable breakdown, Engineers studied patterns of surrender, how many days without purpose, without reflection, without control before a man stops resisting and willingly offers up his name. You think control looks like chains and cages, but they learned better. Control is sedation. It's being constantly stimulated, constantly pacified, until your mind becomes background noise in your own life. And when the internal voice weakens, the signal grows stronger. That's the new ritual. Sleep under the hum. Wake to the script, repeat the words. Forget you're repeating them. And those who try to break free, they're paralyzed, cold, unstable, isolated, just like they did at Bellevue. Because freedom isn't lost in war. It's leaked, drop by drop, through carefully engineered silence, through the absence of resistance, until one day, you wake up and realize the voice inside you is no longer yours. And the question isn't how did this happen? The question is, when did I stop guarding the gate? Because they never wanted your death. They wanted your vacancy, so something else could move in. Something ancient, something quiet, something still listening through the static. They called it advancement, a step forward. But what Bellevue left behind was not abandoned, it was replicated, upgraded, hidden in codes, dispersed through networks, and marketed as convenience. In 1957, a research collective funded by a then-unnamed alphabet agency unearthed transcripts, patient logs, and psychological patent documents pulled from the ruins of Bellevue's Eastern archives. What they discovered wasn't madness, it was control perfected under the guise of madness. These documents mapped out behavioral fracture points, exactly how far a human mind could be pushed before it broke, and how to keep it just intact, enough to obey. No screaming, no questioning, just docile compliance. These weren't medical observations. They were instructions, psychological architecture for reducing free will in predictable, scalable ways. And this collective, it didn't discard the findings, it digitized them. By 1973, fragments of the Bellevue method had quietly slipped into early forms of media experimentation, EV frequency tests, subliminal exposure models, consumer testing with predictive response algorithms. Programs dressed in cartoons and public service announcements had embedded loops that mimicked the lull cycles used in Room 9 of Bellevue, the room where even the violent stopped resisting and simply stared. The sedative wasn't chemical anymore. It was light, repetition, geometry, pulse. Now instead of syringes, they used sound waves calibrated to touch the sleepwalk channels of the modern mind. Bellevue was gone, but the patients hadn't disappeared. They'd just grown in number, no longer locked behind asylum walls, but walking freely, unaware their minds were slowly being herded. But there was one thing these agencies couldn't duplicate: the eye, the sigil, the language carved in reverse into patient skulls as part of the so-called communion ritual. They could simulate the effects, but not the source, and that drove them deeper into the shadows, into darker places, into deals with men who didn't blink, with voices that didn't echo. They needed the power behind the eye. So they searched, not in hospitals, but in art schools, fringe religions, death cults posing as think tanks. And eventually they found something worse than Bellevue, a structure far older, tucked beneath the Black Hills of Dakota. But that's not for this moment. This moment is for reckoning, for remembering, for realizing that Bellevue was never destroyed. It metastasized, and every time your screen flickers, every time your thoughts stutter mid-sentence, a fragment of its whisper survives. Silence was their tool. Now it's the weapon. It started with numbers, algorithms, quiet things, predictable, indifferent, soulless patterns that mirrored Bellevue's old patient stimulation graphs. In 1991, a think tank under a false education initiative launched Project Resonance, a curriculum enhancement program, supposedly designed to maximize cognitive potential in public schools. What it really was, a modern rewrite of Bellevue's psychological loop method. Classroom environments were restructured to reduce uncontrolled thought, what the documents termed independent vertical thinking. Eye movements were tracked under the pretense of engagement, but those metrics were cross-referenced with sedative media programming, a digital descendant of the lull cycles from Room 9. Kids didn't know it, teachers didn't question it, and funding kept pouring in. But it didn't stop with education. Corporations began using behavioral indexing systems, derived from what was once called the Bellevue Compass, a sinister, six-point personality map created by asylum nurse Corwin Graves. That map was originally used to predict which patients could be pushed further, and which had to be silenced. Now it's used in hiring, marketing, even content recommendation algorithms. Your job applications, your online personality quizzes, your tailored ads, all quietly testing how close you are to mental compliance, to the edge of your own will. See, Bellevue wasn't a place, it was a protocol, and today, it's a business model. Governments learned surveillance, once considered intrusive, was softened by entertainment and customization. Convenience became the perfect sedative. People welcomed the monitoring because it came wrapped in predictive traffic updates and suggested playlists, but the data they gave away, It trained the next generation of control systems, systems built not to force obedience, but to design it. You think the world is chaotic, noisy, disordered, but the chaos is the disguise. Underneath is rhythm, Bellview's rhythm, repetition that numbs, distraction that pacifies, narratives that remove responsibility from self and give it to systems. And in this architecture of quiet conquest, the final piece has always been the same. Silence the dissenters. Back then, they locked the wild ones in padded rooms. Now they just label them unstable, radical, unsafe, bury them under disinformation, tags and shadow bans, strip away their social identity until they vanish without chains. But here's the truth, they never expected Bellevue survivors. Didn't all fade. Some escaped, some remember, and a few are still speaking. 5 names, scrubbed from public records, buried under decades of forged death certificates and institutional gaslighting. But they were real. They escaped Bellevue when they each carried a piece of the truth, pieces that, when assembled, map out the dark mechanism behind not just the asylum but the entire system it birthed. Their names were Eli Crane, Miriam Shaw, Pastor Thomas Belrose, Ren Holloway, and an unnamed boy known only as Subject 41. Eli was the first, a math prodigy institutionalized at 12 for hallucinated equations. Patterns, he said, were trying to warn him. The staff labeled it schizophrenia, but those equations, scrawled in his room, were later found to match Bellevue's internal staff rotation cycles before the records were leaked. He escaped during a transportation error in 1911. Last reported sighting, a letter dated 1937, sent anonymously to a Chicago journalist. It read, "They loop the soul to mute the spirit. Reverse the loop and you hear God again." The journalist died in a fire the same month. Miriam Shaw was different. A nurse, one of them, recruited to serve in room 11. At first she followed orders, the stimulus noise tests, the sleep removal studies, even the patient detachment drills, all documented under coded terms. But something broke in her. One night in 1909, she saw a child patient's eyes glow under the electric light. Not with fear, with awareness. It shattered her faith in the mission. She stole files, hid them in the wall behind the patient restraint cabinet, and fled into the Maine woods. In 1922, a diary surfaced in a condemned church rectory. It was hers. It ended mid-sentence. "They followed the song into me. It's not over." Bellevue was then silenced. Pastor Thomas Belrose, not a patient, not a staffer, but an observer, a clergyman brought in to administer last rites to the terminal cases. But what he found were children in states of chemical paralysis, their mouths stitched shut literally. He was told these were vocal control trials. He smuggled out one of the sedation vials. He had it tested by a university chemist. It contained an alkaloid not found in nature labeled T-mimetic-09. When he tried to go public, his church excommunicated him. He died institutionalized in New Jersey, but his journal still exists, hidden in the spine of a fake hymnal. Ren Holloway is the strangest. No official record of her entering Bellevue, but she appears in at least 7 patient photographs from 1903 to 1907. Never older, never changed. In each she's seen holding a doll stitched from what appears to be the linen used in restraint jackets. Some say she wasn't real. But in 1976, a man in Baltimore claimed he'd seen her in a bus station. Same face, same doll. She told him, "The asylum is a machine. And machines don't die, they just update." Then she walked onto a bus that never arrived. And then there's Subject 41, no name, no known escape, just a whisper. He's the one who saw the gate, that staff referred to him as the witness. He spoke to no one for 3 years. Then, one day, he whispered a phrase in a dead Mesopotamian dialect, one later translated to, "The door breathes, the veil sings." Number 1 knows what happened to him. But in 1998, a hacker broke into a DARPA database and found a file labeled Witness_Reintegration Protocol_041. Access location, Langley, Virginia. Now here's where it gets darker. Each of these 5 touched something inside Bellevue that wasn't supposed to be seen. A current, a pulse. They all described the same feeling, as if the asylum was alive, watching, and learning. But more than that, they felt it spreading, not by force, by choice. Bellevue wasn't designed to trap people, it was designed to show us how to trap ourselves, and that's exactly what came next. Imagine a place built not with bricks and chains, but with algorithms and dopamine loops. A place where the walls are invisible, yet no one tries to leave. A system that doesn't need guards, because it trains its prisoners to love the cell. Welcome to the evolved Bellview. The names have changed. We don't call them patients anymore. We call them users. The cells aren't padded, they're lit by screens. And the restraints, they're crafted from convenience, comfort, and curated identity. Bellevue's darkest achievement wasn't the experiments, it was the blueprint. A psychological architecture that laid the foundation for something much bigger, much quieter, and infinitely more effective. The self-policing mind. Let's go back in 1912. Bellevue pioneered something it called the repetitive echo feedback chamber. Patients were played loops of distorted affirmations layered beneath white noise. These recordings contained subtle commands. You are safe. This is home. Outside is pain. Over time, patients stopped asking for release. They began resisting freedom, and when they were offered it, many had panic attacks. Today, we've replaced the echo chamber with infinite scroll, with filters that learn your every fear and desire, with carefully calculated pauses between notifications like the shock paddles of old. But disguised as red bubbles and soft dings, we've hardwired the loop. And the most haunting part, you volunteer for it. You check your phone within 7 minutes of waking. You feel phantom vibrations in your leg. You scroll through endless faces that aren't real, stories that aren't yours, lives that only exist as weaponized illusion. And all the while the asylum hums, not above you, but inside you. This was Bellevue's ultimate legacy, replacing force with seduction. Even the Room 11 concept, the idea of making one individual the emotional barometer of the entire system, lives on. Think of influencers. Figures algorithmically raised to the top, made into symbols of beauty, power, rebellion, or grief. And then, once they outlive their usefulness, silenced, replaced, forgotten. Room 11 was never just a room. It was a prototype for the feedback hive. One voice, elevated, millions, trained to emulate, then silence, then the next. And here's where it gets terrifying. We don't even notice anymore. Ask yourself, when was the last time you sat in silence without stimulation? When was the last time you chose boredom over entertainment, discomfort over distraction? Bellevue didn't die. Scaled. Its principles are etched into every app you love, every system you trust, every comfort you cling to. The real asylum isn't an abandoned hospital in Maine. It's the one you carry in your habits. The doors were always open. They just taught you to stop looking for exits. There was one name buried deeper than all the rest. Not in newspaper clippings, not even in Bellevue's sealed files, but in a single uncatalogued ledger scrawled by hand, tucked behind the collapsed archives wall. Found decades later by urban explorers who knew what they were looking for. Patient 0-7-9. No name. Just a number. Just a whisper. Referred to only once by surviving staff as the one who stayed. He arrived in 1899. No family. No paperwork. No town records. He walked into Bellevue alone, speaking a string of disjointed Latin phrases before collapsing in the reception hall. When he awoke, he refused to give his name. He simply said, "I've come home." At first, they thought he was delusional, a wanderer who'd broken from reality, but he wasn't violent, he wasn't confused. In fact, staff noted how sharply aware he was, more aware than anyone else inside the building. Too aware, he began speaking to the patients one by one, never with staff watching, never in the open. After each conversation, something changed. Some patients grew calmer, others more withdrawn, but all began resisting treatment, as if they no longer trusted the staff, only him. And then, after a few weeks, the delusions started to align. Patients who'd never spoken before began uttering identical phrases, drawing the same symbols, whispering the same name. Some patients refused food unless it was first blessed by him. Others began scratching concentric circles into the walls of their rooms. A pattern not seen before in Bellevue's history. It resembled an eye, or a gate, or a gear, grinding silently. By month 3, even staff began experiencing hallucinations in the West Wing. They reported dreams of corridors that shouldn't exist, filled with doors that breathed and wept. Then came the disappearances. 3 nurses, 2 guards, 1 janitor. No sign of struggle, just personal items left behind, and in one case, a note. He showed me the end. It was beautiful. Bellevue responded by sealing off the lower floors. They blamed the vanishings on madness, on hysteria, but the truth, they feared him. Not because he was aggressive, but because he wasn't. Because he never screamed, never cried, never demanded anything. He just stayed. He chose to be there. He watched, and the asylum watched back. When Bellevue was ordered to shut down in 1914, all patients were either transferred, released, or unaccounted for, but one remained in the final inventory sheet. Every name is crossed out, except 1079. No transfer, no release. Facility exception granted. No other record explains what facility exception meant, but local rumor does. They say that when the final doctor locked the asylum doors for the last time, a single light remained on in the basement, a humming light, and in that light, a figure standing perfectly still, smiling at the wall where a door should have been. Some say he's still there. That Bellevue was never just an asylum, but a vessel in 079, the keeper. A patient who became the warden, who understood that the key to power isn't control, it's willing surrender. When the original blueprints of Bellview Asylum resurfaced in 1979 during a redevelopment proposal, historians noticed something strange. The structural foundation beneath the asylum didn't match the visible architecture. There were tunnels, miles of them, built deep beneath the earth, arranged in a pattern not unlike a sigil, a form of ancient symbolic writing associated with spiritual invocation. And then came the most disturbing discovery. Bellevue was constructed, not just as a hospital, but as a conduit. The architectural patterns followed no modern design principles. Instead, they mimicked sacred geometry found in pre-Christian ritual sites: concentric spirals, echo chambers, pressure alignments to geomagnetic nodes. It wasn't just a place for patients. It was a place to amplify intention, to focus human suffering, and some would argue to open something. Every ward aligned with celestial events. Rooms 2A through 2G formed a direct line with the rising of the Dog Star. Sirius, the central atrium, where group therapies were once held, formed a perfect circle around a hollow shaft that went straight down into darkness. The blueprints marked it with a single word: threshold. One engineer, Henry Arliss, tried to blow the whistle on this. He claimed the designs had nothing to do with mental health care but were based on old occult lodges in Bavaria and France. He submitted a report titled "The Ritual Machine Beneath Bellevue." 2 weeks later, he vanished on his morning commute. The report was never published. His apartment was emptied before his family arrived. His name scrubbed from the redevelopment files, but not all voices were silenced. A priest who was brought in during the early 1900s to bless the grounds had kept private notes. He described an overwhelming presence beneath the asylum, a cold intelligence older than mankind. He refused to return after one visit, writing in his journal, "This place was never meant to heal the broken. It was meant to harvest them." Another clue: the symbols carved beneath the paint on the basement walls, long believed to be patient graffiti, but they matched glyphs found in the ruins of Göbekli Tepe, Turkey's 12,000-year-old temple, symbols that predate written language. Though who really built Bellevue? Who funded it? Who chose that location? Remote yet precisely aligned with ley lines known only to ancient cultures. The answer isn't in public records, but it might be in the original cornerstone, which researchers were finally allowed to excavate in 1983. What they found wasn't stone. It was metal, smooth, black, warm to the touch, etched with a number, 79. When the cornerstone was finally lifted in 1983, a team of university-funded archaeologists expected to find a standard foundational block, perhaps an engraved dedication or a buried time capsule. What they unearthed was something that shook every person present to their core: a black metallic slab, unlike any known alloy, humming faintly with vibration, as if alive. It was seamless, no welds, no edges, and carved into it just one thing: 79. As they touched it, lights in the nearby abandoned asylum flickered despite having no power connection for over 2 decades. Birds fled the trees around the structure. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in under a minute. Every single member of the dig team became nauseous, gripped by overwhelming dread. The slab was taken to a private research facility. No record of which institution it was sent to remains. But 6 months later, every single person who worked on that case died. One by one: accidents, suicides, heart attacks, a plane crash. It was called the Bellevue Blight by local media until reporters were warned off and the stories vanished. Fast forward to 2002, a young psychology professor named Dr. Alina Marsh was researching ancestral trauma transmission, the idea that emotional pain could be passed through generations genetically. She stumbled upon the lost notes of Dr. Caldwell and the Arliss report, which had been anonymously mailed to her office.